Hey guys, I just wanted to take a few minutes and review the config files used by my Sitecore installer script. It's been not quite a year since I've really released the installer script on GitHub. I think the first commit was July 3rd of last year, so in the intervening time, I've had quite a few commits, and the schema of this config file has grown and changed over time to satisfy yet more and different use cases. So I thought um, it might be useful for people if I were to just take a tour of this config file. And I've also recently pushed to GitHub 5 different configs, and really what I think are in those 5 configs 4 archetypal Sitecore roles. So there's a kind of a generic config, but the other 4 I think represent what I've come to view as rather archetypal Sitecore roles. So let's just start by taking a tour of the generic config, because I think to me the config file looks pretty straightforward, but I sometimes wonder if other people feel the same or not, and I thought it might be useful to review that. So from a very high level, the config file is broken up into 2 major subsections, the web server and the database elements. Outside of that are a few kind of just fundamental entries. What's the name of your log file? What's the path to your Sitecore zip? And then the suppress prompts, which sometimes I even regret including it, honestly. Very early on in the development, I had, and I still have, sanity checking around if Sitecore can identify the correct set of file permissions for SQL Server where you're installing those files to. Does SQL Server actually have the rights it needs over those files to attach the database and whatnot? That makes sense if and only if your SQL Server is also on the same machine that your web server is on. And 9 times out of 10, that's just not the case, especially for prod. And I really built the script for production environments. So that sanity checking's still there, but it's kind of a red herring. So that's why there's a suppress prompts value here. And you'll see in the other roles that this is set for true. On the generic, I just left it as false, but really, you can pretty much ignore this because it just isn't possible for for PowerShell, where it's running, to, of course, read the ACLs on a foreign file system, which is usually what's going to happen, right? You're installing Sitecore on some web server, but the SQL server's some different server elsewhere. All right, so the web server. What's all here? Well, some of this is going to look really familiar. Where's your license? What's the root of your install? Like, where do you want me to create the folder that contains your instance root? What's the name of that folder? This last child folder of include directory. In 8.0, there really wasn't a folder that was created for this purpose, but you needed it. If you wanted to enable switchmaster to web, because of the way Sitecore patches its config files, switchmaster to web had to be guaranteed to run after all those other config files ran. And the only way to do that is to put it into a folder that appears alphanumerically after all the others. So my example folder is ZZZ must be last. And 8.1, they've out of the box included a z.switchmaster to web folder. And my script is aware of that and takes care of that. So if this is 8.0, you really should supply that value. If it's 8.1, you don't have to, but you can, so you could override z.switchmaster to web for 8.1 if for some reason you didn't like it. But what's the name of your website? In IIS, this is the logical name in IIS. It has nothing to do with folders. This runtime version, which you probably would never ever touch that. The app pool identity, if you wanted to use a domain account, you could. You don't have to. You can use network service or app pool, application pool identity if you want. For production, you're probably going to be using a domain account though. Later versions of my script supported the notion of having multiple IS bindings, which makes sense, especially if you're dealing with load balanced servers. Now, inside of the web server element, there's two other kind of major sub elements, the CM server settings and CD server settings. So if you're creating a CM server, you really want that to be enabled to true. And I know this says generic, and of course a generic install, like a one-size-fits-all Sitecore instance, is in fact the CM server. It has to be. So let's take a look what's inside here, because it's enabled by setting the value to true. Well, I can specify an instance name, but in this generic notion, don't really need that, don't really care about it. I do override or provide a password for the default Sitecore admin, so that's probably a good practice. No matter what you do, we're not enabling publishing, and we're also not dealing anything with parallel publishing. These are typically things you would enable and mess with in a more scaled out environment. The CD server settings, if this was set to true, then all of these settings would come into play. And honestly, for a CD server, I think all of these should be set to true. They are by default. That's how my config files come out. But if for some reason you didn't like one of these settings, you're not forced to take all or nothing. You can certainly turn them off individually if that's what you prefer. This IP whitelist kind of works hand in hand with CD server settings. The IP whitelist is really a part of this setting here. So there are certain paths and IIS that Sitecore recommends you lock down from unknown IPs. This would be when you're exposing a CD on your DMZ. You probably don't want the /Sitecore path to be available to just anyone. So you would lock these down and by IP, and that's what this IP whitelist is for. Session state provider. There's two kinds of session state, and starting with 7.5. So certainly my script supports 8.0 and 8.1. You can read about, and you probably should become familiar with the differences between these various settings. For a generic, I just figure in proc for both is good. You're really no reason for you to be using a session state provider that's not in memory for a one-size-fits-all server. The Solar base address is will override the value in the default index configuration file. So if that value there doesn't fit you, and it probably doesn't, then you can supply a value here. That's all it does. It merely just writes to that address. It doesn't do anything else in regards to Solar. If you want to enable Solar, you have a lot of other work ahead of you, and my script doesn't really address that. The whole point of my script is to get your instance in place and ready to receive further customizations that can be driven from just normal config file patching. I do, in my own personal use, have a separate script that I've written that deals specifically with flipping between Lucene and Solar as a search provider. I have a more pared down version of that available as a gist on GitHub. A gist on GitHub, however you say that. Okay, so this MongoDB section, I reworked this so that it fully supports MongoDB's specification around the connection string. So any possible way it is you can configure a legitimate Mongo connection string, you can do through just my script through setting these values here. So I don't care if you're using credentials, if you have multiple nodes, if they differ per port, or if you want to use query string options, which Mongo supports. All of that you can do from here. And that really kind of closes out the web server section. Now this database server section, of course, is mainly concerned about the databases themselves. There's a couple of points here that I think bear talking about. First of all, if this is disabled, if this is set to false, then absolutely zero communication between my script and SQL will happen. My script won't sanity check SQL. It won't see if it's available out there. It won't do anything at all. My script will still use some of the information here, namely, what are your database names? Do you have web database copies? But that's about it. So it just pulls enough information from this section of the config to modify the connection strings file, and that's about it. That's if this is false. If it's true, then my script will attempt to talk to SQL at some level. The other kind of control here is, do you want to install databases or not? So if this is true and this was false, then there would still be an attempt for my script to talk to SQL, but it wouldn't try to attach the databases. It wouldn't do any sort of file read writes around the MDF and LDFs, but it would talk to SQL and ensure that the permissions, the user mappings were correct, and that the permissions on those databases were correct. So it'd still do some SQL operations. It just wouldn't do the install part, which really means attaching the database. If both are true, it's going to do everything. So it's going to read through your database names. You really shouldn't mess with this section unless you absolutely know what you're doing. This really should conform to the out of the box names of the databases that we all kind of know and expect. If you want to have web database copies, you can. And what does that mean? That means that my script is going to take the web database LDF and MDF files and literally copy them and then attach them on SQL as yet another database. So if you want to have one or more preview databases, this is where you do that. You could, and you'll see that in these other archetypes when we get to that point. You'll see me making use of this section. If you want to use a preview CD server, there's a lot that goes into it beyond my script. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a few minutes. Okay, so moving on, basic information you're going to need to talk to SQL. What's your server? What port are you on? If you don't have this port, then I'm going to assume it's 1433. What's your install account for SQL, which doesn't necessarily need to be the same as your data access account. And then finally, if this is true, then your data access account's actually going to be the account we specified up here in the web server section. Oh, where is that? I know it's just sitting here right in front of me. Yeah, right here, the app pool identity. So if you have like a domain account here, then you could say, hey, I want to use Windows authentication for SQL data access, which means that domain account's what's used to talk to SQL. If you want to use a SQL login account, then you really should specify a SQL login for data access here. And then this would be false. Finally, my script, if it's going to install those databases, it needs to know what the local path is on that SQL server and what the UNC path is. I wish I could just only use the UNC path or the local path. I wish you didn't have to kind of specify the same thing twice. But the way SQL management objects and PowerShell works, when I make the call to attach, I need to know that local path value. So that's why you have to know both. I suggest when you're working with your DBAs, you work with them to provision a UNC path that points to somewhere on the SQL server that gives the account, whatever account it is that's running PowerShell, enough rights to just merely copy the SQL databases to that install folder on the SQL server. And then once they're there, my script will call via SQL management object back to the SQL Server to attach those databases. All right, so last but not least, there's this database name prefix. Whatever you put here becomes a prefix to the names here. So in my case, it'll be install underscore Sitecore underscore core underscore master web whatever. That's the whirlwind tour of my config file. Now let's take a look at how these sort of archetypal roles differ. So first, let's start with how does generic differ from an example CM. Well, first of all, I suppress prompts, and I give slightly different names for my install folder and my IS site name, which really isn't very much worth remarking upon. The only other major differences then are I do, on my example CM, I do decide to use MS SQL as my private such state provider. You don't have to. It could be in proc. That's up to you. And I also make use of, remember this web database copies? So on my archetypal example CM, I'm actually making 2 preview databases, mostly just to show off the differences between these two. So there's just a normal preview database, and then this preview 2 has an alt preview as its connection string, which means that when my script writes a connection string for preview 2 database, the name on that connection string is alt preview. If for some reason you wanted the names to differ, and there is a reason for that, which I think the use case is really on a CD server, a preview CD server, which we'll see later. Okay, moving on. What are the differences between an example CM and an example CD? There's a few. Some are meaningful, some less meaningful. Again, install folders and IS site name are different. My web bindings, the host header names, a little bit different, but that's expected. So here's the first major difference. For my CD server, which is on the right, I have disabled the CM server section entirely. And then, of course, the CD server I have enabled. So, all right, that makes sense. On my CD server, I'm using private and shared of MS SQL for my session state providers. Again, we're thinking about production systems that could be extremely horizontally scaled, and in that case, you definitely want to be sharing, you definitely want to be using MS SQL as your session state provider for private and shared on a CD. So all that makes sense. Here in my database section, I have disabled installing databases. I sort of assume in my own thinking, the way I run the script, that I run it once per Sitecore instance. So by the time I am running the script to install CDs, I've already run it to install a CM, or maybe even more than one CM. Therefore, the databases have already been provisioned on SQL. That work is already done. So there's no reason to force my script to reinstall databases, but I leave this enabled so that if for some reason I needed to add permissions on those databases, hey, maybe the domain account that talks to SQL on my CD isn't the same as the CM. So I want this enabled so that the permission mappings can still come through correctly. Finally, on this particular CD, it's not a preview CD server, so I'm not worried at all about web database copies. I don't need to do anything with that. All right, let's compare the example CM to an example publishing server. Familiar, hopefully, these install folder names and IS site name. Although this starts to actually matter. When you're horizontally scaling CMs, you need to, well, actually, we're looking at IS website name. What am I talking about? This is just a bookkeeping difference, right? This is the name in IS of your site. So I don't name my IS site the same for an example CM as I do a publishing. And yeah, my bindings are a little bit different depending on the host header. Example pub versus example CM, so on and so forth. All right, now we're talking about instance names, which is what I was starting to jump to before. So when you horizontally scale Sitecore CMs, the CMs need to be named differently. And a publishing server is really just a specialized form of a CM server. So we expect that the instance names are different. We also expect that publishing is enabled on my publishing server, so publishing enabled true. Finally, here I am specifying to my publishing server the same name of my instance so that my publishing server knows that, hey, I actually am the publishing name instance. If I was to run my example CM script in a real environment, then I would also have this example publishing instance name here so that my example CM knew that example publishing was the instance responsible for publishing. So you can certainly use my example configs as a starting point, but you'll need to understand where and when to tweak them. Finally, back to example publishing, I have enabled parallel publishing, so I just set that to true. And really the last difference then is, again, I already have assuming in my example publishing config that the database is already out there, so I'm not going to reinstall them yet again. All right, last comparison. Let's compare a CD to an example preview CD. And how does that differ? So install folders are different, IS site name different, host header bindings, that's different. My example CD, I have in proc for my private and session. This is just because I'm assuming that you don't horizontally scale preview CD servers. Not that you couldn't, I suppose you could, but I figure most people probably won't. So in proc is certainly valid. Finally, and really the only major difference here is this example CD server is going to enable or make use of a web database copy preview. Now, I have enabled the database, meaning permissions will be set on SQL, but I'm not installing because I figured the CM that I installed already took care of installing this web database copy. But again, if let's say the app pool identity on my preview server was not the same as my CM server, then because I have left database enabled as true, then the permissions for that domain account that's running my app pool will be written to SQL. So the preview server's app pool will have the permissions it needs to talk to this preview database. And really, that's the end of the tour, guys. That's all there is to these config files. I've tried my best to comment them to help guide you through what you need to know to set these correctly. I've even gone to the extent of giving you some hints on further work you might need to do when setting up a preview server beyond just getting it installed and ready to accept your config file patches. So always love to hear your feedback. Hopefully this is useful to you. Talk to you later.